2 months had passed since the humans left, and the small problems had become impossible to ignore. The Nexus station looked like a broken puzzle. Environmental controls made the air too hot, then too cold. Gravity generators created random fields that could crush someone or make them float away. Communication arrays kept switching to emergency mode, but nobody knew what the emergencies were. The Vorthik warlord Grikstal stood before the council. His massive frame shook with anger, but underneath was something new. Fear. Our assault fleets are operating at 30% efficiency, he growled. The human tactical programs predicted enemy movements with 97% accuracy. Our warriors are brave, but they die needlessly without proper strategic support. The other military leaders nodded with grim faces. Human generals like Jaesung had changed warfare forever. They did not win with bigger weapons or stronger soldiers. They won with better coordination and the ability to predict what enemies would do. The Vorthik had always thought this was cowardly. Now they understood it was genius. The galactic economy was falling apart. The Zentari had tried to copy human trading programs, but their attempts caused massive losses. Entire star systems found themselves cut off from food, medicine, and basic supplies. The automated shipping networks that humans had built were failing one by one. The human economist Sujin had warned them about how everything was connected, but they had called her paranoia. The ethereal collective appeared in the council chamber with unusual urgency. These beings of pure energy rarely bothered with physical problems. The quantum communication grid is failing, they announced. The human technicians embedded quantum entanglement protocols that we cannot understand. Without them, intergalactic communication will cease within the solar cycle. The meaning hit everyone like a punch to the stomach. The galaxy would break into isolated pieces, unable to coordinate or share information. Each species would be alone in the dark. Council chairman Mordun felt older than his 2 centuries. He was starting to understand the true size of their disaster. The humans had not just participated in galactic civilization, they had become its invisible foundation. Every system they improved, every process they optimized, every problem they solved had created dependencies that nobody had documented or understood. The Krillian Science Consortium had always been proud of their advanced mathematics. They considered themselves the galaxy's intellectual elite, but now they made a shocking discovery. They had been reverse engineering human technology for decades. They had been taking human innovations and calling them their own breakthroughs without access to new human research. Their scientific progress stopped completely. The elegant solutions that human scientists like Wu Jin had developed were based on intuitive leaps. The methodical Krillians could not replicate this kind of thinking. They could copy what humans had already made, but they could not create new solutions the way humans did. The medical crisis hit the organic species particularly hard. Human doctors like Jinne had developed treatments for dozens of diseases that happened when different alien species interacted. The reptilian hegemony faced a plague that human medicine could have easily stopped, but their own medical knowledge was not enough. The death toll climbed. As species after species encountered health problems they could not solve alone. The Kulink hive mind, with their billions of connected thoughts, tried desperately to understand human systems. They failed completely. The collective intelligence that had once seemed so powerful could not process how human minds worked. The patterns humans saw, the connections they made, the creative solutions they found were completely alien to the organized alien thinking. A small group of council members decided to visit the human border worlds, hoping to convince them to return. They found the colonies busy with activity, but not the kind they expected. Humans were taking apart their buildings, packing up their research equipment, and preparing for what looked like a complete departure from known spaces. The human colony administrator Hyun Woo listened politely to their desperate offers. He shook his head with a sad smile. "We are not interested in being your repair crew anymore," he said simply. The delegation returned empty-handed and humiliated. Vorthik military faced their first major defeat in 3 centuries. A small pirate confederation had studied human military tactics and used them against the proud warriors without human strategic support. The Vorthik flew into obvious traps and fell victim to basic maneuvers that any human military school student would have seen coming. The pirates had access to human military textbooks that the Vorthak had dismissed as useless theory. Now those same theories were being used to destroy Vorthak fleets. The irony was bitter and complete. The economic situation got worse every day. The complex financial instruments that human experts like Su Young had created were beyond alien understanding. They had treated human economic theories as unnecessarily complicated now. They watched helplessly as market forces they did not understand destroyed their carefully built trade empires. The Zentari Trade Federation saw their profits drop by 80% in just 2 months. The supply and demand models they preferred were too simple for the complex galactic economy. The derivatives and hedge strategies that humans had developed were keeping the economy stable but without human oversight. These systems began to collapse. Even the Council's physical infrastructure continued to fail. The meeting chambers that had hosted galactic diplomacy for thousands of years experienced critical system failures. The human engineering teams had upgraded and maintained these systems so seamlessly that nobody realized how dependent they had become. Ancient alien technology that had worked perfectly for millennia now failed because it had been integrated with human improvements that nobody else could understand. The climate control systems that kept different species comfortable in the same room stopped working. The translation devices that allowed different species to communicate began producing garbled nonsense. The agricultural systems that fed billions across the galaxy started to fail. Human agricultural engineers had optimized crop rotations, developed hybrid plants that could grow in alien environments, and created distribution networks that minimized waste. The food shortages that followed were not just inconvenient, they were life-threatening. Entire worlds faced starvation as their carefully balanced ecosystems collapsed without human intervention. The farming techniques that had increased crop yields by 300% were based on complex biological and chemical interactions that other species could not replicate. The transportation networks that moved people and goods between star systems began to break down. The elegant algorithms that human logistics experts had created were keeping trillions of beings supplied with everything they needed, but without human maintenance, these systems produced chaos instead of coordination. Ships arrived at destinations to find no cargo waiting for them. Cargo arrived at ports with no ships to carry it. Passengers found themselves stranded on remote worlds as the scheduling systems that had worked perfectly for decades suddenly made no sense. The Council tried to hire expensive consultants from various species to fix their problems. The Krillian Science Consortium charged enormous fees but could not crack the elegant simplicity of human engineering. The Ethereal Collective offered their services but admitted they could not understand human temporal pattern recognition. Every attempt to replicate human solutions failed because the other species were trying to use their own logic to understand human thinking. They approached problems methodically while humans had approached them intuitively. They looked for complex solutions while humans had found simple ones. They tried to force their way through problems while humans had found clever ways around them. The galaxy was learning a hard lesson about the difference between intelligence and wisdom, between knowledge and understanding, between complexity and elegance. The humans had possessed all of these qualities, but the other species had only valued the ones they could recognize. As the failures multiplied and the crisis deepened, the council members began to realize something that filled them with dread. They had never been the advanced civilizations they believed themselves to be. They had been passengers on a ship that humans had been steering quietly from the background. Now the ship was spinning out of control, and they had no idea how to grab the wheel. The Council's first attempts to fix their problems were embarrassing failures. They hired the most expensive consultants from across the galaxy, but even the smartest aliens could not understand human engineering. The humans had built their systems to make sense to human minds using patterns and logic that seemed completely alien to everyone else. The Krillian Science Consortium brought their most advanced computers and mathematical models. They spent weeks trying to decode a simple human shipping algorithm. The program was only 50 lines of code, but it controlled the movement of goods across 3 star systems. When they finally gave up, the lead scientist admitted defeat. This appears simple, but contains layers of complexity. We cannot perceive. A desperate delegation led by Vice-Chairman Zulkar traveled to the edge of human space. They hoped to negotiate humanity's return with better offers and sincere apologies. What they found shocked them. The border worlds were not Empty or abandoned, they were bustling with activity as humans dismantled their infrastructure and prepared for complete withdrawal. The human colony administrator Hyan Wu met with the delegation in a small office. His desk was covered with shipping manifests and evacuation schedules. The aliens offered him incredible deals. Advanced technology, territorial concessions, even leadership positions in the reformed Council. Yan Wu listened politely, then shook his head. "We are not interested in being your repair crew anymore," he said quietly. "You had 57 years to treat us as equals instead of useful servants. Now we are going to find somewhere we can build something better." The delegation returned with empty hands and wounded pride. They had expected the humans to be desperate to return. Instead, they found a people who had moved on. The humans were not angry or vengeful, they were simply done. The economic collapse accelerated as the interconnected nature of human improvements became clear. The Zentari Trade Federation had been the galaxy's commercial powerhouse for centuries. Now they watched their profits disappear as market forces they did not understand destroyed their business models. The human financial expert Su Young had developed trading strategies that seemed simple on the surface: buy low, sell high, minimize risk, maximize profit. But beneath this simplicity were layers of analysis that predicted market movements across multiple timelines and probability matrices. The Zentari had treated these theories as unnecessarily complicated. They preferred their own straightforward approaches based on supply and demand. Now they learned that galactic economics was far more complex than they had imagined. Their traditional methods were like trying to navigate hyperspace with a paper map. Banks across the galaxy began to fail as the derivative markets that human economists had created collapsed without proper management. The currency exchanges that had maintained stability for decades started producing wild fluctuations that wiped out entire planetary economies. The Vorthek military faced humiliation after humiliation. Their proud warrior fleets were being defeated by enemies they had easily crushed before. The pirates and raiders who had once fled from Vorthak ships now hunted them like prey. The human strategic programs had not just predicted enemy movements, they had coordinated friendly forces in ways that maximized effectiveness while minimizing casualties. The Vorthak had dismissed this as overcomplicated thinking. Real warriors, they said, should rely on strength and courage, not computer predictions. Now their real warriors were dying in battles that human advisors would have won without losing a single ship. The tactical coordination that humans like Jason had developed was based on understanding how different enemy types would react to specific threats. This kind of psychological warfare was beyond Vorthak comprehension. The medical crisis spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The reptilian hegemony's plague had mutated into something even deadlier. The insectoid collective faced a viral outbreak that was killing their queens. The Aquatic Federation's people were dying from a bacterial infection that attacked their breathing organs. Human doctors like Jin'ei had been working on treatments for all of these diseases. Their research had been focused on interspecies medicine, understanding how different biologies interacted. When they lived and worked together, the other species had their own medical knowledge, but it was limited to their own biology. The treatments that could save millions of lives were locked away in human databases that nobody else could access. The medical equipment that human engineers had designed was shutting down because nobody knew how to maintain it. The pharmaceutical synthesis plants that produced interspecies medicines were producing useless compounds because the formulas were too complex for alien chemists to understand. The Ethereal Collective made a disturbing discovery about human technology. The quantum communication networks that humans had built were not just copying existing alien technology, they were using principles that the Ethereals had never seen before. The humans had found ways to manipulate quantum entanglement that created stable communication channels across impossible distances. The Ethereals had thought their understanding of quantum mechanics was complete, but human innovations suggested there were entire areas of physics that they had never explored. The gravitational manipulation systems that humans had installed in space stations were creating stable artificial gravity using methods that defied conventional understanding. The Ethereals could see that the systems worked, but they could not understand how the mathematical principles involved seemed to operate on levels of reality that they could not perceive. The council attempted to use military force to bring the humans back, but they quickly discovered a fatal flaw in their plan. The Vorthak fleets could not even find the human colonies. The humans had vanished into uncharted space using navigation techniques and stealth, technologies that they had never shared. The star charts that had guided galactic navigation for thousands of years were incomplete. The humans had been exploring regions of space that other species had never even detected. They had mapping technologies that could find habitable worlds in areas that appeared empty to everyone else. The military expedition sent to force humanity's return spent months searching empty star systems while their homeworld suffered from cascading failures. The few clues they found led to dead ends or automated systems that simply said, "This location is no longer available." The agricultural disasters continued to spread. Worlds that had been successfully terraformed by human engineers began to revert to their original hostile states. The carefully balanced ecosystems that supported billions of beings were collapsing as the biological networks that humans had created fell apart. The hybrid crops that human geneticists had developed were dying because nobody understood how to maintain the genetic modifications. The irrigation systems that had turned deserts into farmland were failing because the water management algorithms were too complex for alien engineers to operate. Entire star systems faced famine as their food production capabilities disappeared. The distribution networks that had moved agricultural products efficiently across the galaxy were producing chaos instead of coordination. Ships full of food rotted in space while hungry populations had nothing to eat. The Council's currency became worthless as confidence in galactic institutions evaporated. The economic models that had backed the standard galactic credit were based on human analysis of interspecies trade patterns without human oversight. These models produced meaningless numbers that nobody trusted. The Zentari Trade Federation declared bankruptcy, unable to maintain their shipping routes without human logistics. The Vorthak military split into competing factions as their unified command structure fell apart. The Kulink hive mind began to fragment as the communication networks that connected their consciousness failed. The most bitter irony came when the species that had most loudly criticized human contributions found themselves begging for help. The Torvan supremacists, who had insisted that human intelligence was inferior, now offered to make humans their ruling class in exchange for assistance. The Zephyrian purists, who had claimed that human technology contaminated their perfect society, watched their cities crumble as their pure systems failed without human support. Their perfect society had only been possible because human engineers had quietly fixed all the problems their purity created. The galaxy was learning that civilization was not about having the most advanced technology or the strongest military. It was about having the wisdom to solve problems before they became crises, the creativity to find solutions that nobody else could see, and the patience to build systems that would work for everyone. The humans had possessed these qualities in abundance, but the other species had dismissed them as mere cleverness. Now, as they faced a galaxy sliding toward chaos, they finally understood what they had lost. The humans had not just been members of galactic civilization, they had been its heart, its mind, and its soul. Without them, the galaxy was just a collection of dying worlds drifting apart in the vast darkness of space. The big meeting room was very quiet. Ambassador Taman put his papers in a box. He did not look angry. He did not shout. He just packed his things like any normal day. The other aliens in the room watched him. They looked confused. Why were the humans leaving? Kang Ho was the human who helped with war plans. He walked past the big scary Vorthak aliens. The Vorthak had always said humans were weak fighters. They thought human war ideas were stupid. Now they just stared at the empty chairs where humans used to sit. The humans had been part of the Galactic Council for 57 years. They helped solve problems when other aliens could not agree. They found smart ways to fix things when everyone else gave up. They were the ones who made peace when others wanted to fight. A tall alien with metal skin came over to Hyjin. She was the human who knew about money and trade. The metal alien made clicking sounds with his voice. He said, "Surely you are just trying to get a better deal. You will come back when we give you what you want." Jin looked up from her computer tablets. Her eyes looked tired. She said, "We are done talking. Good luck with your trade routes." The humans had been running 60% of all the space trade routes. Their math was better than anyone else. They knew how to move things from one planet to another faster and cheaper. The last human ship left through hyperspace. The council members sat in their chairs saying nothing. They had gotten so used to humans being there, they forgot what it was like without them. The Kulink aliens were like a big brain made of many small brains. Their queen speaker said what everyone was thinking: they will come back, they need us more than we need them. How wrong they were going. To Beatty, next morning things started to go wrong. The defense systems that humans had built started showing error messages. No one could read the human language. The computer screens showed red warnings, but nobody knew what they meant. The supply chains that Dongwu had made perfect started to slow down and break, but the council said these were just small problems. They were the smart aliens. They had let humans join their group because they were being nice. They would figure it out. The Vorthok War Chief Grikstal looked at his reports. His ships were only working at 30% power. The human computer programs used to tell them where enemies would attack next. They were right 97% of the time now. His brave warriors were dying because they could not guess what enemies would do the humans like. Jaesung had changed how wars were fought, not with bigger guns but with smarter plans. The space economy was starting to shake. The Zentari aliens had tried to copy human trading programs, but they lost huge amounts of money. Whole star systems could not get food or medicine because the shipping networks were breaking down. The human Sujin had warned them about this, but they said she worried too much about nothing. The ethereal aliens were beings made of pure energy. They usually did not care about physical things. But now they appeared in the council chamber looking worried. The quantum communication grid is failing, they said. The human workers put quantum entanglement protocols in the system. We cannot understand how they work. Without them, talking between galaxies will stop within one solar cycle. This was very bad. The galaxy would split into pieces that could not talk to each other or share information. Council Chairman Mordun had been the leader for over 200 years. He was finally starting to understand how big their problem was. The humans had not just been part of galactic civilization, they had become the invisible backbone that held everything together. Every system they had improved, every process they had made better, every problem they had solved had created dependencies. No one had bothered to write down how these things worked or tried to understand them. The Nexus Station had been the human headquarters. Now it was a maze of broken systems. The air controls made the temperature go up and down. The gravity generators made unpredictable fields that could crush someone or make them float. The communication arrays kept switching to what humans called emergency protocols. None of the other species could understand human computer languages, let alone change them. 3 months before the departure, the council had held a big meeting about human contributions. The Torvan supremacists had stood up and said human intelligence was clearly inferior compared to their own perfect minds. The Zephyrian purists had complained that human technology was contaminating their pure society. The Krillian Science Consortium had claimed they were already improving on human designs and would soon make them obsolete. The humans had listened to all of this without saying much. Ambassador Taman had just nodded and taken notes. When the meeting ended, he had quietly requested a private session with the council leadership. What he said in that room was never recorded, but 2 weeks later the humans announced their withdrawal from all council activities. The signs had been there for anyone who wanted to see them. Human research teams had started packing up their equipment. Human colonies on the border worlds had begun reducing their infrastructure. Human ships had stopped taking long-term contracts, but the council had been too proud to notice or too arrogant to care now. As the broken systems multiplied and the failed processes cascaded into bigger failures, the council members were starting to realize something terrifying. They had never been the advanced civilizations they thought they were. They had been riding on humanity's work, benefiting from human innovations while dismissing human capabilities. The Kulink hive mind, with their billions of connected thoughts, tried to reverse engineer human solutions. They failed completely. The collective intelligence that had once seemed so powerful could not understand how human minds worked. The patterns humans saw, the connections they made, the intuitive leaps they took were completely alien to the methodical alien thinking, the ethereal collective who existed partially outside normal spacetime offered a disturbing observation. The humans perceived patterns across temporal dimensions that we cannot see, they explained. They solved problems before they fully appeared, creating solutions that look simple, but were actually incredibly sophisticated. We have been using their work without understanding its true complexity. The Vorthek military encountered their first major defeat in 3 centuries when their fleets met a small pirate group. Without human strategic support, their proud warriors flew into obvious traps and fell victim to basic tactical moves. The pirates had studied human military books and were using human strategies against the very species that had rejected them. The economic collapse got worse as the connected nature of human improvements became clear. When one system failed, it caused others to fail, creating a domino effect that spread across the galaxy. The Zentari Trade Federation was losing money so fast they might go bankrupt. The Vorthek military was splitting into competing groups as their unified command system, designed by human advisors, fell apart. Even the Council's physical building began to fail. The meeting rooms that had hosted galactic diplomacy for thousands of years started having critical breakdowns. The human engineering teams had upgraded and maintained these systems so smoothly that no one had realized how dependent they had become. Ancient alien technology that had worked for millennia now failed because it had been connected with human improvements that no one else understood. The most bitter irony came when the species that had most loudly denounced human contributions found themselves desperate for help. The Torvan supremacists, who had insisted human intelligence was inferior, now offered to surrender their homeworld in exchange for human assistance. The Zephyrian purists, who had claimed human technology contaminated their perfect society, watched their cities crumble as their pure systems failed without human support. But the humans were gone. They had vanished into uncharted space using navigation techniques and stealth technologies they had never shared with the Council. The few ships that tried to follow them came back empty-handed, having spent months searching empty star systems while their homeworld suffered. The galaxy that remained was getting smaller, darker, and more dangerous. Ancient enemies that had been kept away by human-designed defense systems now roamed freely. Diseases that human medicine had controlled came back with a vengeance. Trade routes that had connected distant worlds for thousands of years became impassable as the complex logistics networks failed. The golden age of galactic civilization was ending, not with a great war, but with a quiet whimper, as the species that had once considered themselves superior struggled to maintain the most basic functions of their societies. The Council had learned a lesson that came too late. True strength was not about military might or technological superiority, but about the ability to solve problems, adapt to change, and find creative solutions to impossible challenges. The humans had possessed these qualities in abundance, but the Council had dismissed them as mere cleverness. Now, as they faced a galaxy sliding toward chaos, they finally understood what they had lost. The humans had not just been members of galactic civilization, they had been its heart, its mind, and its soul. Without them, the galaxy was just a collection of dying worlds drifting apart in the vast darkness of space. 1 year after humanity's silent departure, the Galactic Council faced a reality they had never imagined possible. The galaxy was not just struggling, it was actively falling backwards. Technology that had worked perfectly for centuries was failing. Economic systems that had created prosperity for thousands of years were collapsing. Military forces that had maintained peace were being defeated by enemies who sensed their weakness. The cooling hive mind, whose collective intelligence had once seemed unstoppable, made a shocking admission through their queen voice. "We do not understand how they did it," the voice announced to the stunned council. "We cannot comprehend their solutions, much less create new ones. The humans made their minds work in ways that our billions of connected thoughts cannot process." The admission sent shockwaves through the remaining council members. If the Kulink, with their vast collective consciousness, could not understand human thinking, what hope did the other species have? The beings who had once dismissed human intelligence as inferior were now admitting that it was beyond their ability to comprehend the ethereal collective beings who existed partially outside normal space and time offered an even more disturbing perspective. The humans perceived patterns across temporal dimensions that we cannot see, they explained in their haunting voices. They solved problems before they fully appeared, creating solutions that looked simple but were actually incredibly sophisticated. The revelation was terrifying. The humans had been operating on levels of reality that the other species could not even perceive. They had been solving problems that had not yet happened, building systems that would work for scenarios that might never occur. The elegant simplicity of human solutions had hidden depths of complexity that were literally beyond alien comprehension. The economic collapse had accelerated beyond all predictions. The interconnected nature of human improvements had created a cascade effect that was destroying galactic civilization. The failure of one system triggered the failure of others, creating a domino effect that spread across star systems like a plague. The Zentari Trade Federation had declared bankruptcy, but their collapse had triggered secondary failures throughout the galaxy. The shipping companies that had relied on Zentari logistics found themselves unable to move cargo. The manufacturing worlds that had depended on Zentari supply chains faced shortages of raw materials. The currency that had been stable for centuries became worthless as confidence in galactic institutions evaporated. The economic models that had predicted market behavior for millennia were producing random results that nobody could trust. The financial instruments that had generated wealth for thousands of years were creating massive losses. The Vorthic military had fractured into competing factions as their unified command structure fell apart. The warrior culture that had once been the galaxy's dominant military force was tearing itself apart. The strategic thinking that humans had introduced had been the only thing holding their aggressive nature in check. Without human coordination, the Vorthic generals could not agree on basic tactical decisions. The discipline that had made them effective had been based on human organizational principles that they had never fully understood. The loyalty that had bound their warriors together had been maintained by human psychological insights that were now lost. The species that had survived the initial collapse did so by acknowledging a harsh truth that filled them with shame. They had never been the advanced civilizations they believed themselves to be. They had been riding on humanity's achievements while taking credit for human innovations. The Krillian Science Consortium admitted that their greatest discoveries had been based on human research. The Ethereal Collective acknowledged that their understanding of quantum mechanics was incomplete compared to human knowledge. The Zentari Trade Federation confessed that their economic success had been built on human foundations. The medical crisis had claimed billions of lives across the galaxy. The interspecies diseases that human doctors had controlled were spreading without treatment. The medical equipment that human engineers had designed was failing because nobody understood how to maintain it. The reptilian hegemony had lost 30% of their population to plagues that human medicine could have prevented. The insectoid collective had dissolved into chaos as their queens died from viral infections. The Aquatic Federation was facing extinction as bacterial infections destroyed their breathing organs. The research that could have saved them was locked away in human databases that nobody could access. The pharmaceutical plants that had produced life-saving medicines were creating toxic compounds because the formulas were too complex for alien chemists to understand. Contact with humanity had become impossible as they disappeared deeper into unexplored space. The few ships that had attempted to follow them returned with reports that defied belief. The humans had developed technologies that made their previous contributions seem primitive by comparison. The scout ships that had found human colonies reported seeing impossible things. Cities that floated in empty space without any visible support. Planets that had been terraformed in ways that created entirely new forms of life. Starships that seemed to ignore the laws of physics as they moved through dimensions that should not exist. The humans had not just left galactic civilization, they had transcended it. They had used their time away from the Council to develop capabilities that were beyond alien understanding. The species that had once considered themselves superior were now looking up at achievements they could not even comprehend. The galaxy that remained was smaller, darker, and more dangerous than anyone had imagined possible. The ancient enemies that had been kept in check by human-designed defense systems were now roaming freely. The diseases that human medicine had controlled were spreading without treatment. The trade routes that had connected distant worlds for millennia were impassable as the logistics Networks failed. The communication systems that had allowed instant contact across impossible distances were silent. The energy networks that had powered entire star systems were failing. The council chambers that had hosted galactic diplomacy for thousands of years were empty. The species that had once worked together to solve problems could no longer communicate effectively or even safely share the same space. The unity that had made galactic civilization possible had dissolved into suspicion and fear. The remaining council members held their final meeting in a small room with failing life support systems. The translation devices that allowed them to communicate were producing increasingly garbled results. The environmental controls that kept them alive were creating dangerous conditions. Chairman Mordun, now ancient beyond his years, called for one last vote. The motion was simple: dissolve the Galactic Council and acknowledge that the age of galactic civilization was over. The vote was unanimous. The species that had once ruled the galaxy now faced a future of isolation and decline. The worlds that had been connected by trade and communication were becoming isolated islands in an ocean of darkness. The technology that had made galactic civilization possible was failing without human maintenance. The greatest irony was that the humans had tried to teach them. The research papers that human scientists had published were full of warnings about system dependencies. The economic models that human experts had created included safeguards against cascade failures. The military strategies that human generals had developed emphasized the importance of understanding rather than just copying, but the other species had been too proud to listen. They had dismissed human warnings as pessimistic. They had ignored human safeguards as unnecessary. They had copied human solutions without understanding the principles behind them. The lesson had been taught, but the students had refused to learn. Now the classroom was empty and the teachers were gone. The galaxy was sliding backward toward a dark age that might last for thousands of years. The Kulink hive minds sent out their final message before their communication networks failed completely. We were wrong. They transmitted across the dying networks. We were wrong about everything. The humans were not our equals. They were our superiors. We were not their teachers. We were their students. And we failed to learn the most important lesson of all. The message faded into static as the last communication relay shut down. The galaxy fell silent. As the species that had once shared knowledge and culture across impossible distances found themselves alone in the dark, the golden age of galactic civilization was over. The species that had once considered themselves the masters of the universe now faced the humbling reality that they had been passengers on a ship that humans had been quietly piloting. Now the ship was adrift in the void, and they had no idea how to find their way home. 2 years after humanity's departure, the Galactic Council existed only in name. The grand chambers where representatives of hundreds of species had once gathered now hosted meetings of a few dozen desperate survivors. The rest had either collapsed into chaos or withdrawn into isolation, unable to maintain the complex relationships that had defined galactic civilization. The species that survived did so by acknowledging a truth that filled them with shame. They had never been the advanced civilizations they believed themselves to be. They had been riding on humanity's achievements while dismissing human capabilities as mere cleverness. The grand galactic civilization had been revealed as little more than an elaborate house of cards. The Vorthok Confederation had split into 12 warring factions as their military structure collapsed without human coordination. The warrior culture that had once dominated entire sectors was now fighting itself. The strategic thinking that humans had introduced had been the only thing preventing their aggressive nature from destroying them. The proud warriors who had once dismissed human tactics as cowardly were now begging for copies of human military manuals. The psychological warfare techniques that humans had developed were being used against them by enemies who had studied human methods. The greatest military force in the galaxy had become its own worst enemy. The Zentari Trade Federation had dissolved completely as their economic systems failed. The shipping networks that had moved goods across the galaxy were producing chaos. Instead of coordination, the elegant algorithms that human logistics experts had created were being replaced by random guesswork that created shortages in some places and dangerous surpluses in others. The few surviving Zentari merchants were reduced to operating single ships on local routes. The galactic trade empire that had generated prosperity for millennia was now a collection of isolated businesses that could barely maintain themselves. The economic theories that humans had developed were being copied by other species, but without understanding the principles behind them. The cooling hive mind had fragmented into isolated groups as their communication networks failed. The collective consciousness that had once seemed so powerful was breaking apart. The billions of connected thoughts that had made them superior were now scattered across space, unable to coordinate or share information. The individual cooling groups were reverting to primitive behaviors that they had not displayed for thousands of years. The unity that had made them a galactic power was dissolving into tribal conflicts. The sophisticated culture that had developed through collective thinking was being replaced by crude survival instinct. The ethereal collective found themselves trapped in physical form as the containment fields that allowed them to interact with solid matter failed. The beings of pure energy who had once moved freely through space were becoming prisoners in artificial bodies that they could not escape. The quantum manipulation technologies that humans had developed were the only things that allowed ethereals to exist in physical reality without human maintenance. These systems were failing. The immortal beings who had existed since the beginning of time were facing extinction for the first time in their existence. The medical crisis had claimed entire species as the interspecies diseases that human doctors had controlled spread without treatment. The reptilian hegemony had lost 60% of their population to plagues. The insectoid collective had been reduced to a few isolated colonies. The aquatic federation was facing complete extinction. The research that could have saved them existed in human databases that nobody could access. The medical equipment that human engineers had designed was failing because nobody understood how to maintain it. The pharmaceutical synthesis plants that had produced life-saving medicines were creating toxic compounds. The few surviving medical professionals were trying to reverse engineer human treatments, but their efforts were producing more failures than successes. The elegant solutions that human doctors like Jinneh had developed were based on insights about interspecies biology that other species could not replicate. The agricultural disasters had created famines across the galaxy. The hybrid crops that human geneticists had developed were dying because nobody understood the complex genetic modifications that kept them stable. The terraforming projects that had turned hostile planets into garden worlds were reversing entire star systems that had supported billions of beings were becoming uninhabitable as the biological networks that humans had created collapsed. The soil treatment programs that had increased crop yields were producing toxic compounds. The irrigation systems that had made deserts bloom were creating contaminated water supplies. The few worlds that remained habitable were overcrowded with refugees from failed colonies. The social structures that had maintained peace between different species were breaking down under the pressure. The diplomatic protocols that had prevented wars were failing as species fought over dwindling resources. Contact with humanity had become a legend rather than a possibility. The humans had vanished into regions of space that other species could not even detect. The navigation technologies that had guided galactic exploration for thousands of years were incomplete compared to human methods. The star charts that had mapped known space were revealed to be primitive compared to human understanding. The few ships that had attempted to follow humanity into unexplored space returned with reports that seemed impossible. The humans had found ways to travel between dimensions that should not exist. They had discovered planets that existed outside normal spacetime. They had built cities that floated in the void without any visible means of support. The scout Captain Minho had been the last alien to make contact with a human settlement. His report to the dying council was brief and terrifying. The humans are no longer the species we knew, he said. They have become something beyond our understanding. They showed me technologies that make our greatest achievements look like primitive tools. The humans had not just advanced beyond galactic civilization. They had transcended the very concepts that defined it. They were manipulating matter and energy in ways that violated known physics. They were creating life forms that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. They were building structures that existed in several time periods at once. The species that had once considered themselves humanity's superiors were now looking up at achievements they could not even comprehend. The gap between human capabilities and alien understanding had become an unbridgeable chasm. The teachers had become gods while the students remained children. The galaxy that remained was fragmenting into isolated region. 6 months after humanity's departure, the situation had moved from crisis to complete disaster. The ethereal collective's warnings had come true as communication networks across the galaxy began to break apart. Star systems that had been in constant contact for thousands of years found themselves cut off from each other. The quantum communication grid that humans had built was failing in ways that nobody understood. The ethereals could see the quantum entanglement patterns dissolving, but they could not stop it. The backup systems that should have activated automatically were displaying error messages in human languages that nobody could read. Entire sectors of the galaxy went dark as their communication arrays shut down one by one. The complex networks that had allowed instant communication across impossible distances were replaced by slow, outdated methods that took weeks or months to send messages between star systems. The medical crisis hit the organic species like a weapon of mass destruction. The reptilian hegemony's plague had spread to 12 different star systems. The death toll was climbing toward billions as their medical facilities collapsed without human support. The insectoid collective lost 3 of their queens to viral infections that human medicine could have prevented easily. Their rigid social structure began to break down as the remaining queens fought for control. The unity that had made them powerful was dissolving into chaos. The aquatic Federation watched helplessly as their people died from bacterial infections that attacked their breathing organs. The medical equipment that human engineers had designed was shutting down because nobody knew how to calibrate it for different species. Human doctors like Janae had spent decades developing treatments for interspecies diseases that occurred when different alien biologies worked together. The research databases that contained these life-saving treatments were locked behind human security systems that nobody else could break. The Krillian Science Consortium made a humbling discovery about their own achievements. They had been building on human innovations for decades without realizing it. Every major breakthrough they had claimed was actually based on human research that they had reverse engineered. Mathematical models that they were so proud of were simplified versions of human equations. The scientific instruments that had made them famous were copies of human designs. The theoretical frameworks that had won them galactic recognition were based on human insights that they had never fully understood. Without access to new human research, their scientific advancements stopped completely. The elegant solutions that human scientists like Wu Jin had developed were based on intuitive leaps that the methodical Krillians could not replicate. They could copy what humans had already made, but they could not create new solutions. The agricultural systems that fed billions across the galaxy began to fail catastrophically. The hybrid crops that human geneticists had developed were dying because nobody understood the complex genetic modifications that kept them stable. Entire worlds faced starvation as their food production capabilities disappeared. The terraforming projects that had turned hostile planets into garden worlds were reversing as the biological networks that humans had created collapsed. The irrigation systems that had made deserts bloom were failing because the water management algorithms were too complex for alien engineers to understand. The soil treatment programs that had increased crop yields by 300% were producing toxic compounds because nobody knew how to maintain the chemical balance. The distribution networks that moved food efficiently across the galaxy were creating chaos instead of coordination. Ships full of grain rotted in space while hungry populations had nothing to eat. The logistics programs that had prevented famine for decades were producing random results that nobody could predict. The Council's physical infrastructure continued to decay. The meeting chambers that had hosted galactic diplomacy for millennia were experiencing critical system failures. The environmental controls that kept different species comfortable in the same room were creating dangerous conditions. The methane breathers found themselves in oxygen-rich atmospheres that burned their lungs. The silicon-based life forms faced carbon contamination that dissolved their bodies. The energy Beings discovered that the containment fields that gave them physical form were failing. The translation devices that allowed different species to communicate were producing increasingly garbled results. The universal translators that had made galactic civilization possible were reverting to their original settings, which only worked for the species that had built them. The transportation networks that moved people and goods between star systems collapsed entirely. The hyperspace lanes that had been safe for centuries became dangerous as the navigation systems that humans had installed failed. The automated traffic control systems that prevented collisions were producing random instructions that caused crashes. The elegant algorithms that human logistics experts had created were keeping trillions of beings supplied with everything they needed. But without human maintenance, these systems were producing chaos. The supply chains that had worked perfectly for decades were creating shortages in some places and dangerous surpluses in others. The energy distribution networks that powered entire star systems began to fail. The fusion reactors that human engineers had designed were shutting down because nobody understood how to perform routine maintenance. The power grids that had supplied clean energy to billions of beings were producing dangerous fluctuations. The recycling systems that had eliminated waste across the galaxy stopped working. The atmospheric processors that kept planets habitable were producing toxic gases instead of breathable air. The water purification systems that had made desert worlds livable were creating contaminated supplies that killed instead of sustaining life. The Council attempted to organize emergency response teams, but discovered that their own organizational systems had been designed by humans. The command structures that had coordinated galactic response to crises were based on human management theories that other species could not understand. The disaster response protocols that had saved lives during natural catastrophes were written in human languages and based on human psychology. The emergency supplies that were stockpiled across the galaxy were distributed using human logistics systems that nobody else could operate. The military situation became desperate as the Vorthok forces continued to suffer defeats. The proud warrior race that had once dominated entire sectors found themselves unable to protect their own homeworlds. The strategic thinking that humans had taught them was the only thing that had made them truly effective. The pirates and raiders who had once fled from Vorthok ships now hunted them like prey. The tactical coordination that humans like Jason had developed was being used against the very species that had rejected it. The psychological warfare techniques that humans had mastered were turning the galaxy's greatest warriors into frightened prey. The economic collapse accelerated as the interconnected nature of human improvements became clear. The failure of one system caused others to fail, creating a domino effect that spread across the galaxy. The financial markets that had generated prosperity for millennia were producing chaos. The Zentari Trade Federation's bankruptcy triggered a cascade of failures across the galactic economy. The currency that had been stable for centuries became worthless. As confidence in galactic institutions evaporated, the trade routes that had connected distant worlds for thousands of years became impassable. The insurance systems that had protected against economic disasters were failing because the risk assessment models that humans had created were too complex for alien actuaries to understand. The banking networks that had facilitated commerce across the galaxy were producing random results that nobody trusted. The social structures that had maintained peace between different species began to break down. The diplomatic protocols that had prevented wars for centuries were based on human understanding of interspecies psychology. The conflict resolution methods that had solved territorial disputes were techniques that humans had developed. The species that had lived together peacefully for generations began to turn against each other. The stress of the cascading failures was creating suspicion and fear where there had once been cooperation. The unity that had made galactic civilization possible was dissolving into paranoia and isolation. The Kulink hive mind began to fragment as the communication networks that connected their consciousness failed. The collective intelligence that had once seemed so powerful was breaking apart into isolated groups that could not coordinate their thoughts. The ethereal collective found themselves trapped in physical form as the containment fields that allowed them to interact with solid matter failed. The beings of pure energy who had once moved freely through space were becoming prisoners in their own bodies. The council sessions became increasingly chaotic, as the translation systems failed and the environmental controls created dangerous conditions. The species that had once worked together to solve galactic problems could no longer communicate effectively or even safely share the same space. The galaxy that had once been united by trade, communication, and shared purpose was fracturing into isolated regions that could not help each other. The golden age of galactic civilization was ending, not with a great war but with a quiet collapse, as the systems that